All right, hello again, everybody. Welcome back. It's really good to be with you guys as always. So I hope you're doing really well since our last recorded lecture, and that all your other classes are going well, and everything else in your lives is as well. Um, Today it's a straightforward plan for us. We're going to wrap up the last of our three lectures on Hinduism. This is the third out of three. So there's just a couple of topics left over in Coogan's book, our primary textbook, that we will go over. One of those are the important Hindu views of death and the afterlife. And then we'll also discuss the connection between society and the Hindu religion and the sort of overlap between the social structure of Indian culture and then Hindu belief system and the religious structure of Hindu culture. After that, we'll take a little bit of time to discuss some information from our second author's analysis of Hinduism. That's Huston Smith, as we see in our other textbook, The World's Religions. We don't know how much time this lecture will take. It could be a little shorter than the typical format, only because it's the third out of three, and maybe there's a little less information, but it might take the whole time. So at any rate, that's just one thing to keep in mind at the beginning here. As I've mentioned before, next week in class, we're going to turn our focus to the midterm exam and the midterm review session. The midterm review session is on Tuesday, the 21st, and that's going to be on Zoom. It's going to be an interactive meeting instead of this recorded format, but I'll also take that Zoom review session and post it for our class members that couldn't be there. But I encourage as many of you guys to attend as possible because it's better for you and you'll learn the material and remember it better if you get into that interactive review session next Tuesday. So I'll post the link for that later in the week as we get closer to the weekend. And anyway, then, for now, let's focus on the business at hand and just resume with our third and final lecture on Hinduism. So what we're going to jump into now is the all-important Hindu views about death and the afterlife. So one fundamental and basic doctrine of all varieties of Hinduism is the belief in karma. Karma, a word I'm sure most all of you have heard, but we're going to really learn the Hindu meaning behind the concept of karma instead of the sort of watered down and somewhat inaccurate Western view of the same concept. So the idea of karma first appears in Hindu writings and texts, in sacred texts around the 7th century BCE. That is in between the year, say, 600 and 700 BC. Sometime in that century, we start to see writings emerge which make reference to the idea of karma. Now, I'm putting this in the chat, as I always do, type some notes there. Karma, what does it mean in a literal translation? In a literal translation, it means action. But after the Upanishads, a Hindu sacred text that was written at around 600 BCE, it came to have a more specific meaning, that it more specifically referred to the rewards and punishments that follow from our different actions. So karma is like the accumulated rewards or punishments that are a consequence of the good and the bad actions that people do in their lives. Now, in the West, in like our culture, when people use the word, they generally have this idea. I mean, many people have heard of the concept of karma, and people that have heard of this word, sometimes they apply it to their own lives and to the actions and events of their lives. But the generic Western idea of karma is quite different from the actual Hindu doctrine. Now, you may have used the word or heard people use it in our culture in this way, saying something like, if I do a good deed, then I'm going to get good karma, which might come back to benefit me later. Like, for example, if you pick up litter off of the ground and throw it in a trash can, or you pay for a stranger's meal, or you help an old lady cross the street or take her groceries from the store to her car, you just do like some kind of good act, some kind of act of a good Samaritan or just a little good deed. People think, okay, that's going to come back and benefit me later in the same life. So in Western thought on karma, people generally misapply the concept because they think if you do something good or bad, you're going to be hit with either good or bad karma within the same life. So, for example, if I helped this older lady cross the street or something and it looked like she needed help, maybe later on I'll find a pet that I had lost, or maybe I'll find some money on the ground, or maybe I didn't prepare for a meeting or for an exam at school, and just on that same day it got canceled, so I had more time to study. You might have thought, okay, well, that's good karma from the previous good action coming back to benefit me. And of course, there's bad karma that people talk about too. So, like somebody cheats on their partner, or they steal something from the grocery store, and then later on, they get sick during an important time in their life, or they get a flat tire or something. But but it's not the same in Hindu tradition. I mean, some parts of that have a family resemblance to the Hindu understanding of karma, but there's a big difference. And the main difference is this: in the Hindu way of thinking about karma, karma is not something that builds up only in this life, with the rewards or punishments for good or bad behavior being imposed on the person in the same life where the good or the bad actions were committed. Instead, the true nature of the doctrine to a Hindu involves the belief in the immortality of the soul and reincarnation. So Hindus believe that the soul each person has is immortal. That means that it exists forever and that has always existed. And they say that after a person dies, they experience both reincarnation and rebirth. And that process of rebirth, reincarnation, there's a Hindu word for that, and it's samsara. Okay, so I put that there in the chat as well. Samsara is the doctrine of reincarnation and rebirth that the soul perpetually undergoes as it passes through endless cycles of life and death and rebirth. What the law of karma says is that the positive or negative karma that you accumulate by doing either good or bad things in one life will have the consequences for it imposed on the soul in the next life. So on this doctrine, we've all had countless lifetimes, and positive or negative karma has been built up over the course of these multiple lifetimes. So if you're wondering, when am I going to receive the rewards for my good actions, it might not be that it will necessarily be a reward that you experience in your current life. You may be setting yourself up with a karmic balance of positive karma in the next life. Or if you're doing a lot of bad things, you might not necessarily feel the negative consequences of those bad actions. You may be accumulating karmic negative debt for the next lifetime in your next incarnation to experience. So that's the main difference. In the Western way of thinking about it, it's like, what goes around comes around in the same life. But instead, the Hindu thinks that these consequences play out over multiple lifetimes, and they can build over multiple lifetimes. So again, on this doctrine, if you do a good or bad deed, it's not necessarily in the same lifetime that the cosmic rewards or the benefits or consequences will be experienced. There's words for the gaining of positive merit through good actions that builds up good karma, and the word for that is punya. Okay, punya is the positive karmic merit, and the word in Hindu papa is negative karmic merit. So they don't cancel out either. This is another difference from maybe the Western understanding. To some people, if I did something bad, I have bad karma from that. Now I need to do something good, and those two things will cancel out. So I'll be back to a state of zero. Like the balance can be adjusted such that they cancel out. So you might have thought, well, I could have been punished for cheating on an exam, but then I helped a little kid study for his homework, and those things cancel out. So now I will not have punishment or reward. But actually, in the Hindu way of looking at it, the positive karmic balance and the negative karmic balance, they don't cancel out. So you have to experience the full consequences of all your actions, good or bad. So it's like you will receive a positive consequence for your good actions, and you will receive a bad consequence for your bad actions, whether in this life or the next one, but they don't simply cancel out. So if I did one good thing and one bad thing, then I will receive consequences in both cases, one good consequence, one bad consequence. So you have to experience the full measure of accountability and personal responsibility for the deeds that play out over one's life over multiple lifetimes. So the balance of punya or papa, the balance of positive karmic merit or negative karmic merit, determines the quality of your next life. So you should do a lot of good things according to this view of the cosmic structure of reality, because if you do, then in the next life, when you're reincarnated, you'll have a better and a more congenial experience, better for your happiness and better for the quality of life in that next version of you. The primary spiritual goal of Hinduism is not a blissful afterlife in heaven or in some kind of state of paradise like you've seen in the other Abrahamic religions, except for perhaps Judaism. So, like in Christianity and Islam, the individual soul enters heaven and reposes there for all eternity in this kind of state of eternal bliss. But in Hinduism, instead, the goal is to be liberated from this endless cycle of death and rebirth, to simply make that end. This cycle of life, death, and then samsara, reincarnation, is described as a cycle that involves earthly suffering, loss, and mental and physical pain, illness, disease, trauma, and all the rest. As we discussed last time, there are different paths that some describe as one can take towards the goal of liberation. The word for this liberation from the cycle of life and death, again, is called moksha, which we mentioned in the last lectures. One sacred text of Hinduism, the Upanishads, emphasizes the path of wisdom in order to attain spiritual liberation. And in that case, you achieve the liberation by becoming somehow like intellectually aware of your own immortality. So when you kind of have this transcendent moment that you have a deep inner realization of the immortal or divine nature of your own soul, then that state, achieving that wisdom by whatever means, enables you to break free of the cycle of life, death, and rebirth. And they say that after that kind of wisdom is achieved, you lose the ability to be reborn, which is the goal. In different sects or divisions of Hinduism, there are different accounts of exactly what happens to the soul when you achieve moksha, when you achieve liberation. In some writings and in some views, the soul becomes united blissfully with God. So perhaps not heaven itself, but something not completely incomparable to it. It's a state in which a person and their soul becomes united with God in a sort of blissful harmony. Other writings and views hold a contrary opinion, that when you achieve moksha, that your soul actually becomes separated from God, and there's this blissful state of being able to relate to God from this newly found independence from Him. So as we've learned, there are such a diversity of approaches in Hinduism underneath the sort of broad unifying themes that it does have, that you'll see people taking in these ways quite contrasting viewpoints on the best method to use to achieve liberation, and then also different viewpoints as to what this liberation amounts to, or what state the soul finds itself in after it happens. Is it a union with God? Is it a blissful separation from God? Therefore, you can contemplate Him in a new state of independence. Both views have given there's some scriptural interpretations to bear out both. Some say, on the other hand, that the soul remains in a blissful state with Brahma or with one of his avatars, like, say, Shiva or Vishnu. So depending on the brand or division of Hinduism that a person practices, they may have slightly different accounts of to which deity figure the soul reposes in its liberated state. Is it with Brahman? Is it with one of the avatars of Brahman, like Shiva or Vishnu? It just depends on the practice or the belief of the Hindu follower. There's no real strict or specific details given in the collected Hindu writings as to how the process of rebirth goes for the unliberated souls. Like, for example, these are just open questions. How long, in terms of time, is there between lifetimes? Does the soul die and instantly become reincarnated, or is there some kind of gap in time? There's no real information provided in the writings on that question. There's also this open question of why is it that people don't have memories of their past lives? You know, if I have lived multiple lifetimes and my soul has been on this planet many times before I was born 40 years ago. I don't have any memory of being anybody else except for Richard Vulish, who I am. So why not? If I have a soul that has persisted through innumerably different incarnations, how come I have no memory of those past lives? I don't know. There's no clear answer given to that, but in fact, there are some mystics and wise men that claim that they can tap into or regain some kind of partial access to those memories found in the past lives. But again, that's a question that divides different Hindus and different believers within the system of Hinduism. Many Hindus also argue or say that this life is plagued by suffering and loss, and so what you should do is turn your attention away from worldly things, renounce them, and seek the real and true existence of unlimited bliss and tranquility that you achieve through moksha and through spiritual pursuit of liberation. But others are less negative about the nature of our worldly lives. They would say instead that it can be something that's blissful and even heavenly if you practice proper devotion to gods or God, or take the other paths to spiritual liberation. This view is described on page 157 of the textbook of this Kuban book. So it says there, many texts speak of the repellent nature of this life and urge human beings to seek everlasting real life through the liberation of the soul. Others, however, state that by glorifying God on earth, one can achieve the experience of heaven in your present life. To this goal, sacred pilgrimage centers offer a break from the daily rhythms of earthly existence and the opportunity for divine revelation. Some Hindus consider that a life lived in praise of the divine is a truly joyful experience that is not merely an imitation of a state of liberation, but a kind of liberation itself. So can some worldly corollary to the concept of spiritual liberation be attained in our own lives before we die and are reincarnated or liberated? To some, we can approximate to that goal in our lives through devotional practices and through spiritual progress. Now, as mentioned before, Hindus generally do not affirm any doctrine of heaven and hell where a soul goes after death. Instead, they believe in reincarnation, or if the soul has become liberated, liberation from that cycle. But there are some less central writings in the tradition and some sects within the tradition, some denominations, that do have at least vague, rough concepts that are somewhere parallel to or related to the Western idea of heaven and hell. Again, I tell you that that's not the mainstream of prevailing opinion in Hindu religious doctrine, but since there's such diversity and manyness in the Hindu approach to religion, there are at least some that affirm a kind of vague concept of heaven. In those writings, they talk about generic descriptions of 7 kinds of heavens and 7 kinds of hells. Heavens would be, in this denomination of Hinduism, described as only for souls that have become liberated through moksha, by taking some path to spiritual liberation. The hells are also different from the way it's described in the Abrahamic traditions of, say, Christianity and Islam. In Christianity and Islam, if you're in hell, you're never to be redeemed and you're there forever, and it's endless suffering and torment. But to the extent that there's any Hindu discussion or doctrine of a concept of hell, they talk about it as follows: that if you have a lot of negative karma, so you've done a lot of bad things and that's built up over multiple lifetimes, they say that you may be reborn not on the planet Earth, but in this hellish sort of otherworldly domain, but you don't stay there forever. Once your karmic debt is discharged by being in this hell state for a while, you eventually get an opportunity to be reborn again and continue to pursue your spiritual liberation from there. So hell, if it's ever discussed in Hinduism, again, in most traditions, it's just not. But in those views that do mention it, it's not described as a permanent resting place for the soul, but something temporary, almost like a prison, which one can eventually be freed from if they've paid their debt. In this case, not to society, but to God and to the law of karma. So with that, we've talked about the views of death in the afterlife and reincarnation in Hinduism. Now I'm going to move us to the final part of Kuban's chapter on Hinduism, which deals with the relation of society and Hinduism, or what kind of cross currents can we see in the way that the Hindu society or the Indian society is structured, and then aspects of Hindu religious belief. and how those things inform each other. So as we've learned already, using the term Hindu as a signifier of a person's identity or religion is a relatively recent historical phenomenon, only about 200 years old. Historically, Indians, people living in the Indian subcontinent, have more often identified socially with their social class. And the social class that an Indian is in is determined by the so-called caste system. Okay, so maybe some of you have ever heard about the caste system. This is kind of like a rigid social hierarchy that is believed to be valid by Indian culture and in some way by Hindu culture, since they really overlap. Now, there are 4 specific castes or classes in the caste system, and in the Hindu or Indian word for this is varnas. So, okay, so varnas, that's just a word that stands for the social classes in the Hindu caste system. I should say in, not on, so just put a little typo note. So there are 4 varnas. And within each varna, there's also like thousands of different subclasses. Those are called jatis, so another word for us. Okay, so jatis, just a name for any little subclass or subcategory that falls under the broader jurisdiction of the 4 varnas. So there are these 4 different social divisions, and some people trace the first religious writings that talked about it back to the Rig Veda, one of the Vedas, which is some of the oldest Hindu texts. In the Rig Veda, there's one part that describes a primordial cosmic man, and they talk about elements of the universe being formed from this cosmic primordial man's body. On page 158 of this textbook, they talk about that, and it says here, the earliest mention of distinct social classes within Indian society occurs in the Vedas. In discussing a cosmic sacrifice in which the various elements of the universe arise from the body of a primordial cosmic man, the Rig Veda says, quote, "From his mouth came the priestly class, from his arms the rulers. The producers came from his legs, from his feet came the servant class." And that's from the Rig Veda, chapter 10, verse 90. So let's now talk about what those 4 specific classes are supposed to be, the 4 varnas, as they are called in Hinduism or in Indian culture. So one of them, the highest caste, would be the priests. And they're referred to by the term Brahmin. Okay, so that's the priestly class, Brahmin. Next, we have the warriors and the political class. And the warriors or political leaders, the name of their varna or caste, are the Kshatriyas. So here's how that is spelled. Okay. Warriors and the political leader class, those are the Kshatriya caste. And then the merchant class. The merchants, the 3rd caste, are called the Vaishyas. And then finally we have the low caste, and those are the servants, who are called Shudras. Okay, so just a list of the 4 different social divisions in the caste system there. Priests, Brahmin; warriors or political leaders, Kshatriyas; merchants, Vaishyas; and the servants, which are the Shudras. Now, despite this neat 4-fold division, in practice, and especially today in the 21st century, it's not always clear-cut if one's given profession or vocation is that of, say, like a merchant or a servant. So what I'm telling you is, although there is like this sort of strict social classification system that's really ancient and has existed for thousands of years. Um, in modern times, sometimes it's hard to specifically place one within, say, either the merchant or the servant class. If a person, I don't know, is a massage therapist or a cosmetologist, or like, say, a person that does manicures or pedicures, does this person stand as a merchant or a servant? They're providing a good or a service. Are they allowed to accumulate wealth or not? So there's a little bit of a gray area, and it's not so strictly divided as it might once have been. But the servants are known as being of the lower caste. The other three are called the upper castes. And let me tell you about some of the sort of structured rules that give the sense of what each part does. Only the priestly Brahmin caste is permitted to teach. And in particular, only the Brahmin are allowed to teach the Vedas. Those are such sacred texts with such religious significance that they say only people of the highest caste that have this like long lineage and tradition going back, only those people are permitted to teach the Vedas to other people. The Shudras are not even supposed to read or to teach the Vedas. So they're supposed to be kept outside of the sphere of religious interpretation and rulemaking. Now, you might think that the system's so unfair because it doesn't have the same kind of Western value of social mobility, rags to riches, the great American dream. A person born poor ends up becoming the most powerful and influential member of society. This idea of social mobility and anyone can be anything, it's not really a feature of the caste system social hierarchy. But to Hindus, it's not completely unfair because, keep in mind, there's a strict and real belief in the doctrine of reincarnation. So in the Hindu belief system, whatever varna that you are born into today, it's merited because it's derived from the result of all the karma that you've accumulated over your past lives. So a person, say, born into a low caste, if they're truly Hindu, they would think, well, this is just a disposition and a result of my karmic debt that I built up over my past lifetimes. So there's nothing unfair in the fact that I'm born into a lower caste. Or likewise, someone born into a high caste doesn't just have to be like, wow, what good luck. It's totally random that this happened, but nothing is supposed to be random in the Hindu view of reality or the cosmic big picture. You're born into that caste because you've accumulated positive karmic balance over your past lives, and therefore none of this stuff is unjust or just, people through no fault of their own or through no merit of their own end up having good or bad social membership in the caste system. There are also division of labor justifications for it in Hindu belief and culture. They say that although the different castes are sometimes described as higher or lower, that each one plays a vital part in the overall health and well-functioning of society. So, like the servants, the Shudras, they may be lower social hierarchy on the tier of the social system, but nonetheless, they play a vital role in society because people have to occupy those positions and do those jobs. Otherwise, society wouldn't function. So there's a kind of dignity and value associated with each of the different castes, even though some are like nominally higher and lower. They each are vital in terms of performing a needed social function. Each caste has its own particular set of duties that is unique to itself. As I've said before just now, the Brahmins have sole authority to teach the Vedas, and that's their sole province for them. That class, the highest class of Brahmin, it includes teachers, priests, and counselors. So there's actually like such high degree of reverence for gurus and teachers in Indian culture, and you really kind of feel that when you're over there. Me as a professor going to a philosophy conference, just interacting with some people that I had met, you really get a sense of the deep reverence and like total respect that people have for anybody that's in a field where they educate others or they impart wisdom to other people. So that's the Brahmins. For a long time, the Brahmins did not want the Vedas to be written down in a written format so that they could retain sole teaching authority. Because obviously, once it's written, other people will say, well, I don't necessarily need a priestly Brahmin to teach me this stuff. I can read it and think about it on my own. So that may be one of the reasons that there was no written tradition of Hindu texts until around 800 BCE, even though the religion itself and many of the Vedic doctrines have existed for thousands of years before that. The Kshatriyas, they hold secular power as political leaders or as fighting soldiers. Their duty is to simply defend the people and to organize the political governance of the country. They're permitted to learn the Vedas and read them, but they're not permitted to teach them. That's again the sole authority of Brahmin. But Kshatriyas are allowed at least to read those Vedas. The merchant class, the Vaishyas, they're in charge of other important things in society. They're in charge of commerce, trade, and farming. They produce goods and services that consumers then purchase, and they profit off of the sale and trade of those goods and services. They're also permitted to study the Vedas, but as with the Kshatriyas, they're not allowed to teach them, only the Brahmin. And finally, then there are the Shudras, the lowest of the caste. The Shudras are there just to serve the other classes, especially the high Brahmin class. And, they're not permitted to accumulate wealth. They're not permitted to rise to a higher social rank. As rigid as the system is, it has not always been strictly followed, especially not in the current day. And in practice, it's not always taken seriously by all members of society. But having said that, the system still exists and it does endure. And it does make certain things difficult for people if they're of different castes. For example, it's not socially approved to marry outside of your own caste, or to reject or to rebel against the duties of your caste. If you do that, you can become what's known as an outcast, which is actually the original usage of the term derived from the Hindu culture, but we often have used it as a term in our own English language as just a person that's been exiled from some group or rejected from some group. But the resonance of the meaning is still there, because an outcast is somebody who's now not associated with any caste, having rejected the norms and duties that are particular to their group. So people are born into their caste. It's not like you're determined by your skills or abilities. You're born into that caste, and your family is a member of that caste, and so on. As before, though, even as the system persists, there has been some limited social mobility nonetheless. And I just read you a quote from page 160 of the book that talks about that in brief way. It says, historically, however, there has always been a degree of caste mobility. For example, members of the low castes have sometimes usurped thrones and declared themselves to be of divine descent, thereby raising their caste to Kshatriya status. To this day, people continue to regularly identify themselves by their subclass, their jati, and the entire Indian caste system is such a strong social force that non-Hindu communities, such as Christians, Jains, and Sikhs, have absorbed parts of it. For example, Nadar Christians in the south of India will only marry people of the same heritage. So the caste system really has a powerful social influence on all forms of social interaction and organization throughout India, both throughout history and today, although it is waning in influence to some extent in the modern context. Gandhi, for example, Mahatma Gandhi, revolutionary social activist and wise person of India of the 20th century, he led a nonviolent revolution that gave India independence from British colonial rule. And in the 20th century, he tried to advance the idea of greater respect for the lower castes. So he's a notable figure in contemporary Indian history that tried to push back against some of the, perhaps regressive social aspects of the caste system. For example, some people in those lower castes are often called untouchables if, for example, their occupation involves activities that are considered unclean to the higher castes. And some of those unclean occupations, for example, involve those that have to deal with animal skins or animal corpses. For example, if you're making drums out of animal hides, or leather out of the flesh of a cow or something. These are considered important occupations, but still they're unclean to members of the higher caste, since you have to deal with the dying or dead animals. But Gandhi called the members of these low castes with perhaps less favored occupations Harijans, and that just means children of God. So the the untouchables, the outcasts, and the low castes all together, Gandhi wanted to create greater social acceptance and value towards them, describing them as children of God. And the modern Indian constitution that was created after the independence movement has made, at least legally speaking, discrimination against members of lower castes illegal. Nonetheless, in this complex social framework that I'm trying to portray for you, the bias and disrespect of them does persist. As much as there's been progress, there's still a little bit of inequality, obviously, that derives from that long-standing social system. Aside from caste membership, though, people in Indian society also define themselves by other factors. For example, according to which deities they most focus on or worship, which guru they follow, perhaps, or simply which geographical region that they live in. One last thing to say about the connection of society and religion on this Hinduism is having to do with the viewpoint taken towards women in Hinduism. Hindu women, traditionally anyway, and we see this pretty much across the board in all the world religions, but in the tradition, women are expected to be faithful wives. If their husband dies, they're expected to also remain loyal to the memory of the husband and not to remarry. To be a wife is considered a high honor in Hindu tradition, especially if the woman that's the wife has children. But women do not only play the domestic role in Hindu culture. Women as writers, scholars, holders of important professions, that has existed all the way from the ancient Vedic age up until the current day. So there's a mixed record, I would say, in the West and in other global cultures as to the full equality of women. But Hinduism, I would say, measures up decently well when you compare it to the other major traditions that we're studying and that we will study. So anyway, then, we've now finished our review of Coogan's chapter on Hinduism, so that puts this one to rest for now. And with whatever remaining time I still have today, I just wanted to discuss a little bit of Smith's discussion of the religion that we find in our secondary text, Huston Smith's The World's Religions. So at the beginning of the pages that I assigned to you on this topic from Smith, he discusses the different paths to moksha, and he discusses four paths to moksha. Coogan describes three of them, and there's another one that's maybe less central or prominent in Hindu discussions, but Smith covers all four, and I just kind of wanted to touch base with his view or his presentation of those different pathways to liberation. He notes, as we did, that the word yoga in the mind or language of a Western person like me or you is sometimes different than the Hindu meaning. He points out that yoga to a Western speaker is often related to one's body and a method of, training the body to take on certain poses that enhance flexibility and strength and basic physical fitness. But in the Hindu tradition, it's not as much a physical bodily thing, but it's more a spiritual and mental thing in the Hindu way of looking at it. Yoga in Hinduism is intended to help you liberate your soul and achieve union with God and with the divine. Now, Huston Smith says that there are different pathways, of course, and he justifies the existence of these different pathways on this one basis. So somebody might think, well, why are there four paths if they're all trying to get us to the same place? Wouldn't one path be a little bit more straightforward? He mentions that these different paths make sense because each different path may hold better appeal to a different sort of person. You see, there's different types of people. We're all a little different. Some people are more introspective. Some people are more active. Some people are more emotional. And since there are different types of people, Smith just believes that there should therefore be recognition of that in the different paths that we can take towards liberation. And since people can differ, the pathways should also reflect these differences. So the first path that he goes into is the way of knowledge, which again is Jnana Yoga. So way of knowledge. So this path is best suited to those that have a more intellectual, thoughtful, and introspective nature. If you're that type of person, the knowledge-based pathway is good because in it, you strive to see the essential, infinite, unbounded self within you and the way that it's unified with God. To take this path, you have to be able to see the I, the self, as distinct from the body or the surface level appearances. And then you would try to shift your identity to this everlasting and divine part of you. So Notice how sometimes you can talk about yourself by saying like my arms, my legs, my head. But when you talk about my, it's as though there's a thing, you, that has these objects, that possesses them, but is not identical to them. So, like my body, I'm talking about it, but my body is not me. When you try to shift your focus from the appearances of the body or of the self to the thing that somehow retains ownership over them over time, you're taking this step towards understanding the more immortal and essential divine nature of your soul. Um, think about how you can describe yourself from a third person point of view. And by doing that, you'll gain some insight into the practice of Jnana Yoga, which tries to achieve spiritual liberation through this state of wisdom and recognition of the divinity and the immortality within you. So, there's Richard giving a lecture, I might say, as I'm giving the lecture. Or you, let's say, taking a test, or I don't know, just driving your car. You might think of yourself from the bird's eye view instead of from the given view. Like there goes, you'd say your name as they drive down the street. So thinking about yourself as though from an external point of view gives you this separation between the appearances of the body and self and the observer or the perceiver that experiences it. And so that's one pathway towards spiritual liberation, the pathway of knowledge, which involves this difficult intellectual practice over time of gaining deeper insight into the divine nature of your soul and the immortal nature of the soul. The second path is the way of devotion or love, which is called Bhakti Yoga. So Bhakti Yoga. Now, that's the most popular of the four pathways, the one that most people pursue. And he describes it as being the best suited path to those whose personality or temperament is that they're more emotional than they are like intellectually reflective or introspective. So if you're that type of person, got a lot of powerful emotions and feelings that you direct towards other people and other things, then this might be the pathway to you if you were a Hindu, because it simply asks you to direct all your loving energy towards God, all your feelings of devotion and reverence towards the deity or divine beings. And through that attitude of devotion, love, and just total surrender to that being, you can achieve liberation in this way too. You know, it's not completely different from, say, the Christian attitude of reverence and love or praise that people have of, say, God or maybe the figure of Jesus Christ. The Bhakti way, unlike the Jnana way, does not involve seeing the self as identical with God, but rather as a separate thing that one can love and adore. So Bhakti devotionalism requires that you see God as something other than you so that you can direct your love and devotion toward it. But Jnana Yoga kind of makes you think more about how your own soul is essentially divine. So you see less a separation between yourself and the idea of the divine in the Jnana way of pursuing spiritual liberation. About this love, adoration, and devotion that you're having in Bhakti, this is supposed to be real love, not just a claim of love, not just like you going through the motions and saying you love the divine, but really feeling that way inside. It's supposed to be love that is selfless, meaning that it's not done out of a desire for your own benefit or for your own self-gain. It's supposed to be done merely as service to the being that you love and with no ulterior motive behind it. So you would show this kind of deep love by showing devotion to the deities, chanting their names, going to temples, and so on. The different manifestations of the divine that are seen in Hinduism, sometimes as a woman, sometimes as a child, sometimes as, say, an elephant or a monkey or whatever. The different manifestations of the divine in all their forms allows the devoted person to experience this love in all of its complex variety. And I was thinking about how that is also sort of similar to how in Christianity, a person can attach love towards God in multiple different ways, thinking of God the Father, or thinking of God, the child, like baby Jesus in the manger, or thinking of God as like a friend, who you pray to if you think of Jesus Christ as somewhat more of a companion throughout life. So the different layers of love and the different dispositions and attitudes one can have toward the beloved may be expressed in these different ways, whether it be Christianity or Hinduism. In Hinduism, by giving you all these different avatars of the divine, but there's something that's not completely off base from that in the Christian tradition too. The third path now is the way of action, which is called karma yoga. So karma yoga, the way of action or the path of action. And that appeals to certain other type of personalities. Sometimes people are more active in their lifestyle. They just do things all the time and they're always seeking activities to do. If that's the way you are, then maybe this is the best path. In this path, you pursue your spiritual liberation by doing actions that are good and righteous with no concern for personal reward. You're supposed to act in a detached way to achieve the good and to achieve what's just and right, but without thinking of it as a project that advances your self-interest necessarily. You act in order to do the divine will, and those are acts of service to God, not for yourself, but for serving others and for serving God. And it's on page 38 that he describes this a little bit, so I'm just going to read that. It says, so the attitude of the devotee is, I am the instrument. Whatsoever you do, whatever you eat, whatever you offer in sacrifice, whatever you give, whatever austerity you practice, do this as an offering to me. This is God speaking. Thus shall you be free from the bondage of actions that bear good and evil results. That's written in the Bhagavad Gita, and it says, this person has no desire for the fruits of their actions. Okay? To continue the analogy, he says, a young woman newly married and in love works not for herself alone. As she works, the thought of her beloved is in the back of her mind, giving meaning and purpose to her labor. So too with the devoted servant. He claims nothing for himself. Regardless of personal cost, he does his duty for his master's satisfaction. Just so is God's will, the joy and satisfaction of the devotee. Surrendering everything to the Lord, such people are not broken by discouragements. Surrendering all, do without attachment the work you have to do. Surrender all to me, freeing yourself from longing and selfishness, undisturbed by grief. So that's another way that some can pursue their spiritual liberation through this type of devotion and through this type of action to other people. Well, may want to retract one thing. I use the word devotion, but that's more appropriate to the second path. So had I spoken correctly, I would have said that this path is about action that benefits other people or that achieves the good. And it's done in an unselfish way without any kind of mingling together of a desire for personal benefit. You do it as pure service, and a pure act of service is done for others instead of for you. But somewhat paradoxically, by means of this effort and action toward others, you can achieve spiritual liberation for yourself, although it should not be the main goal. So then after that, Smith discusses a fourth pathway that is perhaps not as central as the other three, and that was why it was left out by Coogan. But this he calls the path of psychophysical exercises. Sometimes they call that transcendental meditation, but the word in it in the Indian term is Raja Yoga. The path of psychophysical exercises. Okay, so this suits people who like to experiment and to explore the limits of their mind and their body. So it takes a series of steps, but through these steps, a person achieves this kind of meditative state, which brings them into a greater consciousness of the divine and allows them to liberate their soul. So the first step of it is you have to clear your mind of all thoughts. You have to make sure there's no distractions, like, for example, your phone ringing or noise or being hungry or having emotions that are distracting you at that time. So you have to clear your mind of all thought and make sure that you're distraction free. Next, you take on a meditative pose, for example, the lotus position, and that helps you through the physical posture to achieve further freedom from distraction and to not feel any distraction by the body or its sensations or its various cravings. This is described by him on page 45, so I'll read that. And it says, when the position has been mastered, it is surprisingly comfortable, and it seems to place the mind in a state that conduces to meditation. Given that standing induces fatigue, chairs invite slumping, reclining encourages sleep, There may be no other position in which the body can remain for as long a stretch, both still and alert. So that's the famous lotus position in which yogis often sit, um, legs crossed, each foot resting sole up on the opposing thigh, the spine erect, hands placed palms up in the lap, one on top of the other with the thumbs lightly touching. And by doing those physical poses, it further enhances the capacity of the subject to gain separation from the distractions of the body or from the environment. After that, you try to focus on practicing controlled breathing. So you try to breathe in a steady, controlled, and regular way. That means you're not supposed to be coughing, sneezing, or drawing in breaths too quickly or unevenly, or exhaling the breaths too unevenly or too sharply. By doing that, you therefore turn inward, and then you continue the process of this turning inward. You start to contemplate yourself and your own soul. You try to focus your mind not on the external environment and the things surrounding you, but you look inside and you try to peer deep into the depths of the soul, becoming somehow serenely aware of the divine and the immortal nature of the soul. After that, the next step of this transcendental meditative exercise is you try to focus the mind on one thing, one specific thing at a time, not allowing intruding thoughts to distract or to disrupt your meditative focus. So like if there's an object in your environment, maybe you just focus on that single thing and you allow that to fill your mind and to block out the mental space for the contemplation or consideration of any other thing. You then try to eliminate the separateness of the mind, which is thinking, and the subject that it is thinking about. Instead, you try to see a unity between the seer and that which is seen, between the thinker and that which the thinker is thinking of. So instead of me, like, I don't know, directing my focus to this hydro flask and being like, okay, I'm focusing on this hydro flask, I'm the focuser, this is the thing being focused on, in this transcendental meditative state, I would try to dissolve the differences between me, the person or the perceiver, and those things which are being perceived. And I would try and just think of how both things are part of one greater reality and are not as distinct as they might have seemed. The final step then, you try to discard the subject of thought itself, and you just replace it with pure thought, which doesn't take any specific topic or any specific object as its focus. That's a state of pure consciousness, which is when you can start to think without any limitations, because the thoughts are formless and with no definite descriptive content. And once you're in that state, the knower becomes united with what it knows, and it recognizes the identity that the soul has with everything else. And this is a state in which a person can start to think that their person or their being is really not so distinct from everything else in the reality, but it is a part of everything else and is identical with those other things too. So that's his rundown of the 4 different pathways to moksha or spiritual liberation. The first 3 were discussed by Coogan, and that 4th one, which is a little bit harder to perfectly well capture in a succinct way, is the 4th pathway, the Raja Yoga of transcendental meditation, or as he puts it, psychophysical exercises. So after that, there's not too much that's left in the writings by Smith that I wanted to talk about with you anyway. After that, he talks about the different castes, which we've already gone over, the 4 varnas and the duties and responsibilities that are unique to each one. Later then afterward, he discusses the difficulty in fully conceptualizing the concept of Brahman. As we've talked about, it is somewhat paradoxical because sometimes Brahman is described as saguna, with attributes. Other times he's described as nirguna Brahman, which means with no attributes. Now, what is up with this quite contrasting way of approaching or thinking of Brahman, either with qualities or with no qualities? Well, when you think of God as a person, when you think of him in personal terms, like a man or woman, a being like me or you, but just at a divine level, in that case, you're tempted to associate attributes with God like you associate attributes with people. Like you might say God is wise, or that he's just, or that he's merciful, or that he's good. But when you think of God instead as just a being with no personal identity, but just a transpersonal being, then you're drawn towards the more philosophical nirguna, no attribute concept or conceptualization of God. I was thinking about how that is also somewhat paralleled in some of the Abrahamic traditions too, because in the Abrahamic religions, we see that same type of dynamic. Take Christianity, for example. When you think of God as Jesus Christ, you think about the human like attributes that he has, that he's compassionate, that he's kind, that he's gentle, and that he cares for everyone and loves them. So it gives you a bit more structure to think about the attributes of God when you think of him as a person. But you can also think about God in the Christian tradition as the sort of formless and incomprehensible Holy Spirit that works his will and creates the universe. And when you think about him in that way, you're sort of thinking about a being that defies all worldly descriptions and is beyond the scope of total human comprehension. So Brahman, I think, just as much as the Christian concept of God, harbors some of the same duality. You know, that when you think about him in a certain way, you think of a being that has qualities X, Y, and Z. And when you think about him in this other, maybe more all-encompassing or broad way, you think that these attributes are somehow powerless to really capture the essence of something that is that infinite. At the very end of his chapter, he briefly discusses a branch of Hinduism that is called Sikhism, and the followers of Sikhism are Sikhs. Okay, so okay, so who are the Sikhs and what is Sikhism? So there was a guru named Guru Nanak, and he's the founder of Sikhism. He was born in 1469 ACE, so not quite 600 years ago. And let's see, he was born in India, which is a Hindu place, of course, but he was born within a Muslim-dominated caste. And he was also born in a region where there were a lot of Muslim people during the Mughal Empire that controlled India for a long time in the medieval time period. So he was influenced by both Hinduism and Islam. And he was drawn to aspects of both of them. According to legend or to tradition, he mysteriously disappeared into a river for 3 days at around the year 1500. And then when he emerged, he said that he had communicated with God and that God revealed to him that that there are aspects of Hinduism and Islam that are both correct. So what the guru said God told him is that he's actually one God, that there are no other avatars. So that aspect of it did reject Hinduism. He said there's just one monotheistic God. He's not present in a variety of manifestations or forms. He also said you don't need to worship images as most Hindus do. And he also said that the Vedas are not necessarily sacred. But the God that he was speaking with, according to the tradition, was described more as a formless being with no attributes, sort of a little bit more like the Nirguna presentation of Brahman than the way that Allah is often described in Islam. So anyway, there are elements of both that he kind of picked and chose out of and, well, was maybe revealed, and that generated the doctrine and the basis of Sikhism. So it's not polytheistic, kind of more like Islam, but the nature of God and the pathway to winning his favor is a little bit more in line with Hindu tradition and belief. Now, there were 9 more gurus that followed in a succession after Guru Nanak. But after the death of the 10th one, the sacred text of Sikhism had already been formed over the generations. And they said that now there's no need for any further gurus because the sacred text of Sikhism can replace the living guru. That text is known as, let me write the name of it here. Okay, so Guru Granth Sahib is the name of the holy text of Sikhism. And what that translates to in English is collection of sacred wisdom. Okay, so the collection of sacred wisdom, Guru Granth Sahib, that's the holy text of Sikhism. The text is now venerated rather than a living guru. Since the 10th guru had deceased, this text is used instead of a living guru figure for the religion of Sikhism. Male Sikhs are easy to spot because they wear the distinctive turban. That's a religious requirement for male Sikhs. There there's a number of sort of religious requirements in the religion, and one of them is that males are not to cut their hair since they believe that it is a source of vitality. So that means that to remain in a state of cleanliness, they're supposed to cover their hair with a head covering, and that's the turban. Um, Sikhs have sometimes been persecuted since they're not perfectly in line with either Hindu or Islamic beliefs, and they're a religious minority wherever they are at. There's only about 15 million Sikhs in the world today, but you do see adherents to Sikhism, of course, in the West and in global cultures as well. So I've noticed that some people don't understand that like a person wearing a turban is not like some people in the West just wrongly assume that this is a person that is Islamic or a Muslim, but in most all cases, a person with turban on is a Sikh, which is a sort of again intermingling of Hindu and Islamic belief structures. But anyway, they also have differences from mainstream Hindu practice. For example, they don't have the same requirement that priests should live a sort of humble or celibate life. So they also don't say you have to renounce worldly possessions or things. Therefore, Sikhs are often family people that have wives, children, or husbands and children. They raise children. They run businesses, and they also donate 10% of their income to charity. So just a few basic quick facts about Sikhism as we wrap up our notes on the Hindu religion. So when I said at the beginning of today's lesson that it might not run as completely long as some of the others, I guess that turned out to be true for just over 1 hour. And that's all the content that I had for us on the Hindu material. So anyway, thanks everybody for tuning in again. And I'll be in touch with all of you guys over the weekend. I'm going to post the Zoom link for the Tuesday review session, and then I'll keep you in touch about the specific time window that you'll be doing your midterm on Thursday, the 23rd. I'm also flexible on that. So any student that has any issues with the designated time slot, contact me on an individual basis, and on a case-by-case basis, we will determine what better time slot would work for someone. But I want it to all be on the same day, at least Thursday, the 23rd. Okay, guys. Well, thanks so much. I really appreciate all your time and attention to the class. Stick with it. We still have quite a ways to go. There's 8 more weeks. So I don't want anybody to, run out of steam. We got a long ways to go, so pace yourself. But for now, thanks a lot. Take care, and I'll be in touch if you need anything. You can always message me anytime. Okay, guys. Thanks again. Bye.